Wednesday, 4th June, 1862. Captain Hudson's mental deterioration is becoming dangerous. During the march from Fair Oaks, Private Burns fell out of ranks directly behind the captain. Captain Hudson halted the company and called me up just before Dr. K reached him. The boy could not have been more than 15, despite the age that fatigue had forced on him. I watched the doctor as he drew open the boy's jacket. A great mass of blood soaked his shirt. He had been marching for an hour with a bullet in his gut. I started to kneel to help the surgeon if I could, but the captain stopped me. "Give this soldier to the count of 3 to get back in ranks, then shoot him if he doesn't comply." I tried to tell him that the boy was wounded, but he drew his pistol and cocked it in my face. "I will not suffer insubordination. The count of 3 or you will be shot in his place." I couldn't move. Captain Hudson began counting. 1. I stared down at the surgeon, who closed the boy's jacket and shook his head to indicate yet another loss to our company. 2. I brought my pistol from its holster, yet held it unsteadily pointed to the ground. I glanced to Captain Hudson. His face was unmoved. 3. I didn't really even aim. My bullet somehow found its own way through the boy's neck. Captain Hudson put his pistol away and started the company moving again. I stood with Kay a moment beside the body. The boy looked so much like Will. "Mama, I need a new doll," Lucy said as Rebecca lifted her from her seat at the breakfast table. "Why? Don't you love Mariette?" "Mariette's gone to heaven. Auntie can't find her no more so she can fix her leg, so she's dead." "Just because you can't see someone doesn't mean that person's dead." "Grandma said that Aunt Clara's cat went in the woods and they couldn't find it for days and days, and it died 'cause nobody could find it no more, and I haven't got Mariette for 60 years, so she's dead and I need a new Mariette." Rebecca and Lucy looked up as they heard the front door shut. Teague passed by the dining room door. "Why are you not dead?" Lucy yelled to him. Teague stopped and looked in the doorway. "What?" "Why are you not dead?" "Because not everyone who loses a leg dies," Rebecca answered for him. "Mariette died 'cause I can't see her no more." Teague smiled. "Oh, she's not dead. I'll show you." He started up the steps as Mrs. Warner called to him from the kitchen. "Captain, won't you have some breakfast?" "I'll be down directly." He turned his head toward the bottom of the stairs. Lucy had one foot on the first step, but she was waiting for him to increase the distance between them. He raised his eyebrows at her, as if to include her in a secret, then continued up the stairs. "She's been a very good girl," Teague said, as he entered his room and moved toward the dresser. "She didn't cry or anything while she was with me." He rolled up the housewife that lay on top of the dresser, then opened the first drawer and lifted the doll out. Lucy stood at the doorway for a moment, then finally ran into the room and reached up for Mariette. As soon as she had the doll, Lucy ran back for the door. She stood a room's length away from Teague to examine her. "She's got stockings now." She lifted the handkerchief material that covered Mariette's legs. "Well, she's got a scar on her leg where I sewed her, and she was a little embarrassed by it. I made her those to cover it up." Lucy saw the scar as she lifted the stockings, then nodded. She stared at Teague for a moment. "Put yours back on." "What?" "Get your leg and sew it on." "My leg is far, far away from here. I can't sew it on." Lucy stared at his stump. "Does it hurt?" "Sometimes." "Then you're a good girl too, 'cause you don't cry." Lucy started down the hall toward the stairs. Teague followed her out, but then stopped as Lucy turned back to him. "Bend down," she said as she came near him. She pressed the doll's face to his and made a kissing sound before running away. Tuesday, 8 July, 1862. I am reminded of a passage from Jeremiah as I think on the last 7 days of almost constant fighting. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord, and by his fierce anger. Most of the regiment is gone. Our company was hit hardest. Billy, Tad, Clay, Ethan, all the boys of the Thursday night Thespians, all dead. I read Shakespeare and Emerson with these fellows. They cared for me when I got sick from my first cigar and when I got heartsick from my first love. They were my friends. Captain Hudson died in the hospital today. I watched as a bullet ripped through his chest, and I caught him before he fell face down in the mud. I had command for a few brief minutes, in which we did nothing of consequence, before we were ordered to withdraw. Aubrey helped me carry the captain behind the lines. Our old professor had a rough time of it these last few months. Perhaps God has given him peace. Aubrey laughed when I told him this. He's beginning to doubt many things, but I must not. If I don't have God, what do I have? I don't know when I've seen a hotter day. Makes me wish I could have stayed in Coretta's cellar, Annalee said as she pushed her hair back under her bonnet. Sam just shook his head beside her on the seat of his brother's wagon. It's too hot for those boys to be out like that. He nodded toward Brighton's livery stable, where even the youngest of the Brighton boys was astride a green horse, while the others watched from behind the fence. We'll get a bad storm later. Mark my words. What's this? Sam said as he reined in the horses outside the mercantile. A crowd of people was gathered at the newspaper office. Casualty list, Annalee said. Wait here. Sam tied off the reins and hopped down. Annalee watched him work his way into the crowd. A woman sat down hard on the boardwalk several feet from her. Annalee could not tell who she was, as her face was in her hands, but frowned at the casualty list clenched in the woman's left hand and the wedding ring that reflected the sunlight into Annalee's eyes. She saw Sam emerge from the crowd. He read as he walked back to the wagon, stopped for a moment in the middle of the street, then took Annalee's offered hand to help her down from the wagon. He handed her a copy of the list. Jack Tierney. Oh, no, Annalee said as she read for the name of the schoolteacher's brother under the italicized killed in action section. Will you take me to Miss Tierney's today, Sam? Sure. He took off his hat and smoothed back his hair. You can start visiting today, but I think you'll be doing it tomorrow, too. He nodded toward the list. Annalee read further. James Peterson, Robert Carson, Elroy Parker, Rupert Weiss. She shut her eyes. I don't want to read any more. She opened her eyes to the crying widow on the boardwalk. When the lady finally looked up, Annalee caught her breath in recognition. Jane Strong, who had lost her first husband to typhoid, and now had apparently found that she'd been waiting in vain for her second husband, Carl, to return to see the son who was named for his predecessor. Annalee and Sam stood in silence by the wagon for several moments before he spoke again. They've got the first of the draft drawing results up beside the big copy of the casualty list. Daniel was right. His was the first name up there. He turned to the mercantile, swore under his breath, and hit his leg with his hat as he walked in the door. Annalee stayed by the wagon and watched other people coming out of the crowd. George Cole, errand boy for both the owner of the newspaper and the telegrapher, elbowed his way through with a bundle of papers to put in his saddlebag, and then rode his horse out of town, presumably to deliver to people in the outlying areas who had a relative on the list. There was Emma Collier, looking lost with her 4-year-old son clutching her skirts. They lived off the generosity of the townspeople because she could neither tend the 160-acre corn crop on her land nor sell it, since everything was in her husband's name. Some people said she couldn't decide whether she wanted her husband to live or die. If he lived, he'd come home to drink and beat her, but if he died, the house and land was willed away from her to a cousin in New York. Apparently, her fate had been decided for her. and poor, elderly Mr. Phillips. Annalie watched him fold the list before even reading it, and then walk the couple of 100 feet to his house and sit in the chair on his porch. He opened the list, and Annalie knew he must have seen the name of his son, the only family he had in the world, but he simply refolded it and continued to sit there. Next door to him, Mrs. Brighton was intent on beating every speck of dust out of a rug and seemed determined to ignore the commotion across the street. She had no one left to look for on the list. On Monday she had received a letter to inform her of her brother's death at Chancellorsville, 2 months after the fact. She must have been mortified to know that she had celebrated Independence Day when she should have been in mourning. Already she'd dyed her dresses. The one she was wearing used to be peach-colored, if Annalie wasn't mistaken. The sleeves were turned up to give Mrs. Brighton some relief from the heat, and splotches of black dye speckled her arms where the color had bled. Annalie looked over to the Brighton boys in their father's corral. They were still yelling to little Michael to hold on to him, and "You're riding him like a girl." Michael was actually doing pretty well. Annalie marveled at how he could stay on. Of course, he was riding one of the tamer wild horses, if one could say that. She started over toward the boys without really thinking about it. They didn't seem to notice her until she was right behind them. The oldest, Johnny, happened to turn toward her, then punched his other brothers in their arms, to gain their attention. All 3 took off their hats. "Miss," Johnny said, as he nudged Marcus to get Michael off the horse. "Can I help you with anything?" Annalie shook her head. "Oh, I just came over to admire your brother's riding. He's quite good for someone so young." "I'm almost 9!" Michael yelled over to her, as Marcus attempted to calm the horse down so his brother could dismount. Johnny excused himself and climbed over the fence to help Marcus. Annalie leaned against the fence beside Edward and watched as Johnny unbuckled a belt around Michael's waist and helped him slide out of the saddle. "Can I help you, Miss Annalie?" Mr. Brighton said, and stepped out of the stable, wiping his forehead with his handkerchief. "I was just admiring your boys." "Yes, they're a good bunch. Except that Johnny's been hankering for a soldier's uniform. Can't make him see he'd be putting his mom through that." Annalie followed his motion to the group in front of the newspaper office. "Lord knows she's been through enough already." The boys let out a collective yelp when the horse started to fight them as they tried to lead him out of the corral and into the pasture behind the livery. Finally, they managed to shut the gate behind him and climbed the fence back into the corral. "They certainly are accomplished horsemen." "Yeah, but that little one's going to need some work." "What is that contraption they took off him?" "Oh, that's just something I came up with. The boy kept pestering me to be allowed to tame one of the horses, but his ma thought it'd be too dangerous. I partly agreed with her, so I made that belt to ease both our minds. I'd like to see him lose his balance with that thing on." "How did you make it?" "Well, it's just a belt that fits around him and fixes him in the saddle. 'Twasn't very hard." "If I gave you some measurements, could you make one for me?" "You can sit a saddle as well as any girl around here. Why do you need one?" "Balance.